Alors, je viens de finir Le Premier Homme par Albert Camus. Now, I did not read this in the original French, but I kick myself. And if I ever get the chance to read any more Camus, I very much want to read it in the original French. But anyway, so yes, The First Man. Just, it's strange, probably a strange one to start with, having never read any Camus, to start with basically the manuscript that was found on his body as after he died. Sort of his final work published posthumously 30 years after he died. But it's also kind of a neat one to read for the first, because it's so biographical. Doesn't sound like strong enough of a word. It's so much him. It's so much as Albert Camus as a person. Yeah. So, anyways, so it's I really enjoyed this book. It was just the first page. You can tell from his writing, even in translation, just what a brilliant writer he is, and how the writing just stands out so much compared to other things that I've read. It's like I read a lot. Well, I think I read a lot, but you can the quality, you can just tell the quality of his writing. It's just beautifully written. So I've been thinking about this as sort of three stories in one, or three. I don't know if stories is a word, but yeah, three stories. So first of all, it is a fictional account of a man in his 40s, or just turned 40, who is returning from France to Algeria to meet with his mother and to reminisce. I don't know if reminisce is a nice word, but while he was in France, he visited the graveyard of his father, who had died in the First World War. This was the first time he'd ever been to the grave of his father. At age 40. And upon going back to Algeria, he speaks with his mother about it, and he sort of goes around town and asks different people who had known his father, what was his father like? Because he never got to know his father. His father died in 1914, the first year of the First World War, and that was the year following his own birth. So he never knew his father, and so it's sort of the search for his father, but also as this man is going through sort of the places of his childhood, he is recollecting events that occurred, and it quickly it starts to jump back and forth between him thinking about stories of when he was a child in Algeria, and what he experienced and whatnot, but it quickly, that sort of jumping back and forth disappears, and it quickly becomes just the story of his childhood. So that's the first story, is this fictional account of a man in search of his past, and remembering his childhood. But it is also the story of the man writing it. It is also the story of Albert Camus. This is an extremely autobiographical account, from what I understand. The character Jacques Cormery, he is Albert Camus, because he was born the same year as Albert. Camus' father died the same year as the character's father in this book. So it is a retelling of his own story. So it's the story of the man, and then the second story is the story of the man's childhood, and then sort of this fictional account of the man and his childhood. So it's sort of these three interweaving threads that all sort of tell the same story. Yeah, and because it's a non-edited, unfinished draft, basically, a first rough draft of this novel that Camus was working on before he died. It is so raw. The lack of editing, and the lack of the footnotes, and the little notes he writes to himself as he's writing it. That's what I mean when I say it's not just a fictional account. It's very much when you sort of look back on it, or sort of zoom back from the narrative and you see these footnotes, and these notes he's writing to himself, and these ideas and these sort of one-off words and thoughts that sometimes have no meaning to us, the reader, but would have intense meaning to him, the author, as he was writing it. So reminding himself to go back and to look at different things or different experiences or different memories. And so you can really see the author in the text at such a level that I've never read before. Like, for example, at times he will mistakenly name one of his characters the real name of the person that he is writing this account of. Sometimes he will shift between first person and third person. So he's writing in third person this fictional account, but sometimes he will be so much in the flow that he will write as if it's first person, as if it happened to him because it did happen to him. And it's incredibly personal. And all of that, had he lived and finished and edited this, all of that would have been edited out and we wouldn't have experienced that. But it's just phenomenal that how you can see that, how he can just, there's a couple pages where the entire 2 or 3 pages are one whole sentence. It's just nonstop. Him just writing his feelings, his thoughts, his emotions, just writing. That sort of thing would not have made it past the first draft, I imagine. So it was just incredible to see that. Yeah. Whew. Anyways, so yeah, it's just raw. It is this man's. It's almost not a diary, but it's, I don't know, it's incredible. So I've got some things written down here. So yeah, he sort of recollects his childhood. So playing with the boys, his fights that would occur, going to school, a hunting trip with his uncle, how he grew up in such absolute abject poverty. I mean, poverty is a very relative term, but like, I mean, he got by. He got to go to school. He got to go to the lycée, the high school on scholarship. And he talks about how he had to convince his grandmother and his mother, mostly his grandmother. His mother was very passive, to allow him to go to the lycée, despite because they wanted him to go work to make money because they needed money. So like his hunting trip with his uncle, I talked about that. So he grew up in poverty. So I found it fascinating because the level of poverty was so strong that these people, his family, there was no past for them. There was only present and the future. The past did not exist. There was nothing in the past that had a value to them. The only things of value to them were things that would allow them to survive. They were purely existed on a basis of survival. They're every waking hour. Everything they did, everything they owned had to have a purpose that benefited their survival. And so they had no past. Like the man, Jacques Cormery, when he's 40, going back to meet his mother and asking about his father, she doesn't really have anything to say because it's in the past, and that to her is sort of something she doesn't ever think about. She's like, well, yeah, I was married to this man for a time, and then he died, but like, he can't really get anything out of her because the past doesn't exist. They're so frugal, only necessities existed, even mental necessities. So like reading, writing, language. His family's illiterate. They don't even have, their vocabulary is so limited that certain words like library and school, they hear these words, but they don't really have a meaning to these people. It was just, the way he wrote that was just phenomenal. How like his father, he specifies in the English translation they use the word handicap, that is, or sorry, not his father, his uncle. And his uncle is also described as being deaf, a deaf mute, but he does speak, but very limited speech. And his mother is also described as being a deaf mute, which is interesting. So I don't know if it's a genetic thing or what, but I don't know if they had sort of mental or intellectual handicaps, or if this was purely a result of their necessity, because the grandmother seems quite intelligent and capable, but she's also illiterate and sort of has no time for any of this nonsense that does not directly benefit her in her daily life. I have one quote here. I don't usually quote books, but he said, "Work in this neighborhood was not a virtue, but a necessity that, in order to survive, led to death." And that just resonated with me so much, that work in this neighborhood was not a virtue, but a necessity that, in order to survive, led to death. When he's discussing how this neighborhood, they would fight so hard to ensure that they can keep their work, even though the work, the only end goal, the only end, they would work only in order that they could continue to work. The work only led to a survival which perpetuated their ability to work. The only end is death. There's nothing beyond or outside of work. They work until they die, and they demand the rights to continue their extremely difficult work, extremely demanding work, because they want to keep surviving in order to eventually die. And it just incredible. And just some of the stories he tells are so relatable. It feels so real. Like, he tells a story of him when he's young, and the boys, they go into this park when they have a bunch of sort of medical vials and bottles and whatnot, and they get a whole bunch of different plants and berries, and they grind them all up and add water and make these potions and poisons, and it just felt so vivid and so real, and just little stories like that. It's like, yes, well, I remember doing that stuff like that when I was a kid, and I'm not in Africa in the early 20th century. And just the way he describes the geography, the heat and the weather and the seasonal patterns in Algeria, it was just incredible. Another thing about geography is how his mother, he says, has no idea of where she lives. She has an idea that there's something called France that is across the sea, and that there's something called Spain that is also kind of nearby. But like, when he asks his mother, "What country do we live in?" she's like, sort of gets upset because she doesn't understand what he means, and then he says, "Well, we live in France," and she goes, "Oh, well, yes, of course, we speak French, we're French." Just how there's no conception of space, and like, I kind of understand that I've spoken to people who have no concept of history, which to me, who've studied history and have a very vivid like timeline in my head of the events and places and people, but to others who have no sense of that, events that occurred millennia apart to them seem like they could have occurred subsequent to each other, just because they are in the past, and the past is a singular place, and things that have happened are in the past, and no idea of the scale of the past, and spatially or temporally. It was just very thought-provoking. And anyways, so he talked about the yearly school at the Lycée, when the yearly award ceremony that his grandmother and his mother would go to, and how he felt such shame for their poverty, and how they felt such they didn't really understand why he needed to go to school, but after the award ceremony, when he won an award, they were very proud of him, and his grandmother wanted to show off to others, to her friends or whoever, that yes, he had won an award. He is intelligent or whatever. And he talks about how his grandmother didn't understand when he was being punished for bad behavior at school, how that behavior was separate from grading his grades. So if he had detention, she sort of assumed he was doing poorly in school, when actually academically he's doing well, and how there are different dimensions to what it means to go to school. But to her, it was all sort of one thing, that hard work meant good behavior, which meant doing well, which was a virtue, and these were all sort of one. I'm all over the place, but it was just fascinating. And it's sort of near the end, he talks about how he had his summers off, but in Algeria the summers were exceedingly dry and exceedingly hot, but he would still, those were sort of his free time, where he would go and play with his friends. And then when he was 13, his grandmother made him work, get a summer job to make money for the family. And of course that resonated very much with me. And how he describes the work as being just utterly monotonous and dreary. And even though he was working sort of an office job where he wasn't being physically laborious, to him that was more real work, was the physical labor in other jobs. But it was so monotonous and dreary, and those sort of words that he felt it was sort of at this point it was sort of the death of his childhood. He didn't have the open skies and the open seas and the wide open spaces and the freedom to roam during his summers. Now he had to obey these strict working hours, and that's sort of where it ends, is this moment when his grandmother's beating him or whipping him, and he grabs the whip from her and makes as if to whip her, and she flees to her room, and he's like, well, at that moment she never whipped me again. And that moment, he was probably 14 or almost 15. That's sort of, his childhood was over at that point. And that's near where the manuscript ends. There's another very, very small chapter where he talks more about himself as an adult. And again, are we talking about himself, Jacques Cormery, the character, or are we talking about Albert Camus? I don't know, but he talks about just his sort of joie de vivre, his love of bodies, as in the warmth and physical touch, and not purely romantic or sexual, but even just leaning on a friend's shoulder, and the warmth and the radiance from being close to someone. And he does talk about romance, and describes a woman and youth, and how their youth is leaving them. It's just such a beautiful novel. But it's very short, and it is not a complete novel. And I'd love to read one of his other works, so I feel like I know the man now. And that's obviously a conceit. There's no way you can know a man based on 221 pages, but I'd love to read one of his earlier works and just see, especially in the original French, and just compare the two, see what his final products look like, if they're anything like this. But I think the raw, unedited, true nature of this is what makes it so special to me. Anyway, so that's my little chat on how I felt about The First Man by Albert Camus. It was wonderful.